The Civil Rights Movement was a pivotal period in this anthology of United States history. We've heard stories about the movement through history books and through the perspectives of great civil rights activists and leaders. For many, the names of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks come to mind instantly. But what about the neighbor across the street? Or the local high school student? What was everyday life like for Black Americans during this time? What we'd like to share with you here are the individual stories of artists, reporters, family members, and veterans, and how the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s impacted their everyday lives. These are their snapshots of everyday life.
Childhood remembrances are always a drag if you're Black.
You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet.
And if you become famous or something, they never talk about how happy you were.
To have your mother all to yourself and
how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in.
And somehow when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you
understood their feelings as the whole family attended meetings about Hollydale.
And even though you remember, your biographers never understand
Your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes.
And though you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you.
and though they fought a lot, it isn't your father's drinking habits that make any difference.
But only that everybody is together and you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases.
And I hope that no white person ever has cause to write about me.
Because they never understand Black love is Black wealth.
and they'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while, I was quite happy.
Our story begins with the exploration of the Civil Rights Movement, a time that shook the United States, in the best kind of way. Organizations like the college-led Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, gave young Black people a voice in the Civil Rights Movement. Here to tell our first chapter about activism is one of the movers and shakers of the movement, multi-award-winning poet, writer, and activist, Nikki Giovanni.
SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was started at Fisk University by Diane Nash. And Diane Nash and John Lewis and Reverend Bevel, James Bevel, left campus inviting other students to come with them. And I remember when they left campus, we were not going. I was not going at that point, but we clapped and we wished them well. We didn't know what was going to happen. That's where SNCC started. And John, of course, continued in the movement, and he joined on with Martin Luther King and with the SCLC. And as you know, at the March on Washington, John Lewis was the youngest person to speak.
After SNCC's inception, its members went on to help people register to vote, orchestrate sit-ins, participate in the freedom rides, and play an active role in the March on Washington. But the road wasn't always easy. It took hardships and hard work.
So SNCC was important because young people went down. Bob Moses was a young man then. Julian Bond was a young man then. And they went down to Mississippi. They went down to Alabama. And they taught people. And they helped register people. And we know that James Chaney and Swerner and Goodman were murdered because they were trying to discover why this one man was lynched. And they were murdered. And we didn't find their bodies for another 3 or 4 months. The students decided that they needed to do something. The 8th and 9th graders, they decided that at a certain hour, I think it was at 10 o'clock, they were all going to work out of school, going to protest. Birmingham turned the fire hoses on those youngsters. We haven't done nearly enough looking into what happened to them. So we know that those young men and women who were being hosed, know that they probably, even today, because they would only be in their 70s, are still having problems with their back or problems with their legs. And these were very brave people. They were a little younger than the college students, but they too were a part of the generation that said, we have to do something. We are tired of being abused.
Everything that SNCC stood and fought for took a different kind of determination, one that only prevails in numbers. Similarly, the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened 5 years before SNCC's inception, required that same kind of tenacity.
When we go back to Montgomery, Alabama, and we go back to the bus boycott, it was the women who got up in the morning and they made lunches for all of the men and all of the women who were walking to work to make this boycott work. So I think we have to look at how everybody did what they could do. And some people just said, okay, all I know how to do is make a sandwich. Everybody did what they had to do. So I think we all responded to the fact that something had to change and we had to do our part.
Because of SNCC, the front porch was no longer just a stage for refuge and rituals. Because of SNCC, the front porch was a place of free thought and discussion.
Because of SNCC, the front porch was no longer a setting for humdrum chores. Because of SNCC, the front porch took on an atmosphere of hope and promise.
Because of SNCC, hearts and minds were set on attaining first-class citizenship. Because of SNCC, Southwest Georgians marched for freedom and filled the jails.
And many cities changed laws and afforded new opportunities to Black people. Because of SNCC, young imaginations grew and soared.
Young people dreamed of opportunities that had not been open to them in a segregated society. They realized that new doors were open and many things were possible.
They could expand their horizons and become more than they ever dreamed. Because SNCC and Charles Sherrod came to town.
To continue on with our story, we shift from our focus of activism to the idea of the Black American dream. With the glimmers of success right in arm's reach for many Black people, consequences followed. Here to tell our next chapter is photojournalist, producer, and USC Annenberg faculty member, Dr. Mickey Turner.
That's really where the complacency kind of started, I think, in American culture, because everyone just sort of subscribed to the more is better thing. And, people essentially stopped marching after King's death because there was no one really strong enough to pick up that mantle. A lot of Black folks had become really comfortable with their situation, because now you were no longer talking about getting a seat on the bus. You were talking about the square footage on your house. But part of that came out of Ebony magazine and the types of stories they featured. And, this is what success looks like. You got a nice luxury car. You've got a 2,000 square foot house or whatever. You dress this way. You have a closet full of clothes, that whole thing. And, in retrospect, that was a really sort of dangerous narrative to send out because what it did was it made people comfortable and complacent. And so the Civil Rights War was still raging on, but people are like, yeah, well, I got a house, enough to eat, and a great car.
Though many did subscribe to the Ebony magazine mindset, it was also met with pushback from those who knew that the movement had to be sustained.
It's great to see these young people pick up the mantle because old people like me, we're tired. We really are. And, my generation knew that you had to be the change that you wanted to see, but we were kind of still in that sort of framework of, okay, got to get a good job. Let's get married and have the 2.5 kids and the golden retriever and the periwinkle Volvo station wagon. So Jennifer Lewis put it quite nicely. We let this generation down because we stopped marching. We stopped fighting. And she's right. We did. So, when I talk to some of my students and they tell me that, the onus shouldn't be put on them to affect change. I'm so glad that John Lewis and Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth and Ralph Abernathy and Diane Nash didn't feel that way. Because where would we be?
The other infamous figures of the civil rights movement weren't the only ones to raise their voices and uplift. Celebrities, from singers to actors to athletes, use their platforms to inform their audiences about the social issues going on in their own backyards.
There were certain celebrities that were down for the cause, and that was a beautiful thing. When you look at some of the people who marched with King, like Sidney Poitier and Diane Carroll and Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis and Mahalia Jackson and Aretha Franklin and James Brown and people like that. They don't often get the credit for their activism. They did their part to try and make things better for everybody. They knew that they could use their platforms to influence and enrich and inspire, and God bless them. They did that. It was some really interesting times, and I'm sorry I missed the era of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Jim Brown and all those guys who were really on top of it, who really kind of stepped off the field to be activists. I do remember seeing Lou Alcindor play when I was young, before he became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and I'm very grateful for that experience. And Bill Russell and all those greats.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and Skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
There will be no highlights on the 11 o'clock news, and no pictures of hairy armed women liberationists and Jackie Onassis blowing her nose. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Keys, nor sung by Glenn Campbell, Tom Jones, Johnny Cash, Engelbert Humperdinck, or the Rare Earth. The revolution will not be televised.
The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about the dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat.
The revolution will not be televised.
Will not be televised.
Will not be televised. Will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Preachers, activists, and celebrities were key players in the movement toward equal rights for Black Americans. But what we must realize is that the time period wasn't solely strict activism. Black people were taking the world by storm with their music, films, and dance, celebrating their Blackness and breaking barriers. Here to tell our next chapter is stage director and professor of opera at USC Thornton, Ken Kazan.
James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, Nina Simone, everything she did, everything she did. She did a really famous recording of an art song called Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair. Somehow she made that resound a political level. And it was beautiful. At least that's how I felt it and saw it. But everything she did, to be young, gifted, that still, when I see that clip of her on Sesame, that to the children. So I get moved so easily by art that is for a reason. Sammy Davis Jr., who was stuck in a horrific place in his career and his life, who finally realized how poorly he was being treated by Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and the boys. So much great theater, Hair, the music Hair, the musical Pearly. There are so many great shows that came out of that era, and great artists, great stars who never settled for being performers. They realized that they had a pulpit and they had something to say. And they were freedom fighters, there's no question. And I will always be grateful for it.
These aforementioned freedom fighters used their craft to articulate the feelings of the time. This was especially done on screen, with the raw performances of Black actors and actresses that reflected the intensities that life brought to Black Americans, from racism to survival.
Once upon a time in the hometown of mine,
during the early 60s was hatred, bigotry, and crime.
The law said colors were black
and white people, governed by Jim Crow laws,
all separated by train tracks without any real cause.
There was tension in the air. Separation and segregationists were everywhere.
Through signs of despair, sadness, and gloom,
new hope and bright future was about to bloom.
Though movies showed us everything from wrongful convictions to drinking from fountains labeled white only, these were the kinds of experiences Black people encountered every day. Experiences like housing discrimination, school integration, and the racism that hid below its surface. Here to tell our next chapter is retired marketing executive, small business owner, commercial real estate agent, and my father, Marshall Duncan.
The reason I was the first Black kid in the kindergarten because there was West Compton and East Compton, and at that time, and there was Watts. So Watts was where they basically put all the Blacks, and then West Compton opened up, and East Compton was still exclusive white. If you wanted to buy a home in East Compton, you couldn't buy one. At that point, you couldn't buy in East Compton, you couldn't buy in Long Beach, Redondo Beach, those outlying areas were still considered all white. My uncle was a real estate agent, and there was a house that was available in East Compton, and it was all white. And so he told my dad that, there's a house in East Compton, and he was able to get us in. And so my dad thought he was giving us a big step up. He bought the house in East Compton, and we had all white neighbors, and the schools were white, and I was the first Black kid that was in kindergarten. They were doing blockbusting. What they did was, once we moved in, we were like, you see a string on your sweater, and you pull that string, and then the whole sweater unravels. That's what they did. We moved in, and then the realtors were doing, it's illegal now, but it was called blockbusting. And so they would just go to all the neighbors and say, Blacks are going to be moving in and your property values are going to drop. And so there's a mass exodus. I mean, from the time I was kindergarten, first Black, by the time I was in first grade, it was half. And it just took over, and people were leaving so fast that they didn't even have time to sell their home. They were just homes that were just empty, and the city would just come in and board them up. My dad worked at McDonnell Douglas, and he worked with his coworkers, were white. One of his best friends, who made the same amount of money as he made, same job and everything. When my dad bought in Compton, his friend bought in Fullerton. My dad couldn't buy in Fullerton. No Blacks were allowed to purchase in Fullerton. And it's funny is, as we grew older and I look back, when my dad sold the house, after they retired and everything, he sold that house for $400,000 and only paid $18,000 for it. But his friend sold his house for $1.8 million, and he bought his for the same price. If my dad had bought in Fullerton, he would have got the same, but he couldn't do it. In those days, that's how it was done.
Housing discrimination against Black people wasn't anything new at the time. It was pervasive and happened all across the country. It stopped Black families from attending good schools, accessing good jobs, building wealth, and bettering their communities. For my father, it struck his family in ways that would echo for generations to come.
Our mighty white leaders talk about patriotism, which is supposed to be the foundation stone of our nation.
But those leaders can't understand that there's a lot of unrest among Negro people because of their treatment in America.
How am I, as a Negro, supposed to feel about going to a place where I got a good chance of not coming back? And if I do get back, I'm still treated like a second-class citizen.
The lives of Black Americans were multifaceted, but what many seem to forget in the uncovering of history is their role in the Vietnam War. This was the first U.S. war where black and white men weren't formally segregated. In most cases, black men don't get the chance to tell their stories and are overshadowed by white narratives. That said, here to tell our final chapter is Vietnam War veteran, prior TWA employee, retired educator of 17 years, and my great-uncle, John Garman.
I had gone to college for a little while, but, I had a pretty good job. I had just bought a new car, didn't really want to go. Everything was going pretty well. I was trying to avoid being drafted into the infantry, so I took an extra year. Yeah, we had training. It was combat training. Everybody goes through basic training, but before they send you to Vietnam, they send you through an additional period of training. So it was just a little bit more intense than the actual basic training.
For many black men in the war, fighting alongside white soldiers brought a multitude of experiences, from camaraderie to racism.
It was definitely different. And there was a lot of stress going on because Martin Luther King got assassinated and all the blacks were really upset about it. It was almost a riot. Yeah, it was a little bit intense, everybody walking around with loaded guns. So they kind of left us alone. They knew we were upset. We all kind of pretty much hung together. Everybody was kind of separated into their own groups. It was segregated, but, we worked together. But when we wasn't out, we all went to our own little cliques.
Back on U.S. soil, the Vietnam War began to garner many negative opinions. As the public watched on from their living rooms, one sentiment remained the same. Black men were being sent to fight a war for America when they still weren't being treated equally at home.
I didn't feel it was actually my war. So why am I going over there to fight for something that's not really going to benefit me? But I knew it wasn't going to benefit me because there wasn't anything that was going to directly affect my life. When I first got back, I was kind of proud of my uniform or whatever. Then people look at me like, why did you even do that? When I got home, I don't wear the uniform very long. But some people were asking me, about what was it like? Why did you feel like you needed to go? I knew if I didn't go, I was going to go to jail. Ali had really been against the war, and they really took him through a whole lot of changes. And that actually made me not want to go also.
The war offered a rough road for those who lived through it and came back home. The atrocities of Vietnam weren't left as forgotten memories. They were burned into the minds of those who experienced them.
Once I'd gotten back, I learned a lot. I grew up a lot while I was there. I saw things a whole lot more, a lot differently once I got back. I was kind of naive when I went, but I saw things, a whole lot differently. I knew I didn't take a lot of things for granted anymore. Yeah, I made some decent, some pretty good friends. I had some guys that I served with that, didn't make it back. Definitely missed them. Oh yeah. It was pretty intense, once you've been working with someone closely, side by side, and something happens to them, it affects you pretty much. You try not to get real close to someone because that might happen, but you can't help but getting close because you're working in close contact. So if something happens to one of them get killed or something, yeah, it affects you. Once I got back home, I really tried to just put that way back in my mind, so I didn't want to think about it a lot. So I didn't really do a whole lot of grieving. Once I got back, I really tried to set that out.
Here are the stories, the ones that aren't written in every history book or memorialized in stone. These are the stories that ground our history, that make us remember the humanity behind the movements we read about. These stories help us move forward. These stories fuel our continual progress. We can learn from the everyday experience and amend the narratives of history we've become all so familiar with.
foundation stone of our nation. But those leaders can't understand that there is a lot of unrest among Negro people because of their treatment in America.
You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
There was tension in the air, separation and segregationists were everywhere. There were signs of despair, sadness and gloom. A new hope and bright future was about to bloom.
The front porch took on an atmosphere of hope and promise. Because of SNCC, hearts and minds were set on attaining first-class citizenship.
They never talk about how happy you were to have your mother all to yourself and how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in.
Because they never understand. Black love is black wealth. And they'll probably talk about my hard childhood. Never understand. But all the while, I was quite happy.
Young people dreamed of opportunities that had not been open to them in a segregated society. They realized the new doors were open and many new things were possible. They could expand their horizons and become more than they ever dreamed.